Today we're going to talk about something very, very important. In fact, it's so important that by virtue of you understanding it, you're going to have a better understanding of yourself and other people. You're going to understand people that come from a very different set of values, that have a very different background and a different set of beliefs. Additionally, we're going to look at how beliefs act like a set of tools that produce real value in someone's life. And all of this is going to act like a map that's going to show us how we got to this moment in time. What values and beliefs are currently in conflict in producing our cultural wars and where we're headed next. So, without further ado, let's jump in. By looking at each of the major technological revolutions, the different eras of human history, we can get an idea of how we thought and we saw the world change over time in relationship to our abilities. And this is a core feature of ideology, that on one end, what ideology does is that it takes what a society is doing successfully and it codifies it into a set of ideas that allow the next generation to have a very well-defined path forward. It tells them what's valuable. It gives them a way to extract that value and to create that value. And so in that sort of sense, ideology is very useful. It's like a tool. It's a tool for helping society extract value from the things that they value. On the other side of the coin is that as a society extracts and creates more and more value, they fundamentally transform the world. And when they transform the world enough, they do that on two levels. The first level is that they create an enormous amount of surplus value of the thing that they actually value. And ironically, that becomes less valuable. The second level of change happens that as a society produces more and more value, it fundamentally changes the nature of that society, of their world. And when they change their world, the very environment that made these values valuable is no longer the same environment. And now a new set of values are going to be more valuable in the new environment that has come as a byproduct of this past value system. And so let's look at some examples. I want to run through these is because I want to get to where we are today and how this impacts the existing ideologies, how they're in conflict with each other, and where we're headed next. So ideally, this is going to act like a map. It's going to give you an idea of where we were, where we are, and where we're most likely going. We can start with the hunter-gatherers. The hunter-gatherers, their chief problem in life was food scarcity. They didn't have enough food. They had an entire society that was built around hunting and gathering. They would move and follow the animals. Even their belief systems reflected this sort of lifestyle. So, for example, some of the things that the tribes believed in was a large spirit world. In some sense, this is a projection of power. They're imagining this external nature to be more powerful than they are. And so they have to pray and appease the animal spirits and so on in order to be able to get favor in terms of finding food and so on. And the people that were really good at creating these sort of narrative stories were the shamans. And what the shamans did was they were able to take intuitions and insights that they had that they probably might not have been able to even explain. Patterns that they've noticed that are really hard to put into a logical framework. They were able to take this and they were able to turn it and weave it into stories and insights. And then these stories and insights acted as a bedrock, a foundational narrative that helped the society come together and move forward towards finding food, hunting, and so on. And so the stories, they addressed life, they addressed death, they addressed their purpose in life, and then them being a collective communal unit. This problem of food scarcity wasn't solved through their ideology, through their belief systems. Instead, what happened was that one day, somebody noticed that if you plant a seed, lo and behold, food comes out months later. And in the very beginning, it was probably just one or a few individuals that noticed this. And as they shared their ideas and experimented and were able to repeat this process of farming, it became more and more common for tribes to farm until eventually a tribe started to turn into a farming society. This relationship was drawn between seed planting, plant coming out and sprouting and then it turning into food. And would that change? Everything changed. No longer were they nomads that would go out and hunt and forage for food. Instead, now they were, in some sense, domesticated. They had to live in the area they were in and raise the crops. They had to take care of the crops. They had to protect the crops from other tribes that might want to come and steal them. They might have to protect the crops from animals. And they would have to think for the very first time about resources, like where do they get water from, and so on. And so all of a sudden you started to see a shift towards living next to a river or a riverbed. Other things that happened during the agriculture age was that for the first time humans started to think about abstract things like land disputes, who owns what, and social hierarchies. And then the hard problem that they faced was the enormous amount of labor it took to maintain crops. And so at some point they started to use animals to help with crop manufacturing, like ox. And as we evolved through this age, we went through a few different ideologies. You can call the first types of ideologies more or less the rule of power. Whoever has the power creates the rules. And what that means is that if you have the power, you can go and you can take someone else's crops and so on. And so having a military all of a sudden became very valuable. And now they have to think about resources. They have to think about military and security. They have to think about governance and hierarchy. And all of a sudden you have all of these different things that have come together. And then on top of it, they have to consider that other similar city-states like them would want to come over and take their land and territory. Maybe it was good land and territory, maybe it was in a good location. And this cycle forced this sort of arms race that took us through the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and the Classical Age. Now, the problem with the rule of power is that in nature, it's subtractive. It's a net negative. There's only so much plundering you can do before you run out of things that you could plunder. And once you run out of things you could plunder, then there's no way for you to move forward. Now, this is the most optimistical case. The most realistic case is that as you're plundering and you have massive initial gains, think of the Greek Empire, they got bigger and bigger. But then what ends up happening is that running and managing an empire like this requires extraordinary managerial skills. And typically, rules of power don't have such managerial skills. And so there's this huge cost now, managerial bureaucratic framework, that needs to be on top of societies that are producing value through farming, as an example. And there's only so much you can do before you have the law of diminishing returns come to fruition. And eventually what happens with any law of power is that they eventually burn themselves out. They're like a great big fire. They come in, they swallow everything up, and then without much time, there's not much left for the fire to feed on, and it burns itself out. And that's only half of the problem with power-based empires. The other problem is cultural, and that is that in order for you to have a power-based empire, you have to have an ideology and a set of values that is centered around power. A good example of what these sort of values produce is the Roman Empire. And one of the things that the Roman Empire really valued was having successful conquest. A general would go out, he would conquer some lands, he would come home as a hero, and then could challenge the emperor for the throne. And so this resulted is that the most successful generals would both expand the Roman Empire and they would challenge the authority of the sitting emperor. And this led to a lot of civil unrest and civil war. So it was inherently destabilizing. And this brought us into the rule of order, which is what happened in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages and the ideologies that came out of them was that the way to rein in this unlimited power of kings was through the rule of law. And the rule of law meant that everybody had to play by the same rules, and that ultimately, even kings had to answer to God. And this is a very fundamental shift in how humanity starts to see life in reality. And that is that now we've gone from the shamans, where nature and spirits and it's polytheistic, to now we've gone to monotheistic, is that there's one fundamental type of truth, and that even kings have to answer to it. And this brings us to a very important insight about a strict relationship between how a society produces value and its beliefs. And so, in the example of the shamanic tribes and the empires that followed and this law of power, there was many different avenues of power. And so the societies of those eras saw that there was many different gods. They were polytheistic in nature. They saw that power can come from anywhere and can come and try to conquer them and so on. With the shamans, for them it was a spirit world that they were in communion with. And by being in communion with that spirit world, they can gain insight into how to navigate it. And so it was more communal in nature. Now, in order for agricultural societies to survive and thrive the rule of power, there was only one way forward, and that was the rule of law. And through the rule of law, that is condensing all these powerful agents into one powerful agent. Instead of there being polytheism, now we go to monotheism. And in monotheism, there's one source of truth. There's one fundamental reality. And what you have to do is align yourself with that truth and with that reality. And that is where the idea of a single God comes from. Now, in the traditional agricultural age, anything that was ever created, whether it was a sword, a food, a home, and so on, was created by somebody. And so we had this view of the world that reflected how humans created value and how they created things in the world. Since humans had to create things, and anything that was ever created was created by somebody, and here things come full circle. The way we are experiencing life in the moment, the way we're creating value in our relationship with people, with society, within life, that gets mirrored into our beliefs about reality itself. And so with the traditionalists, what that meant was that there was a single powerful God that created everything. And out of that, there is an inherent meaning, an inherent purpose, a very specific truth. Now, everybody would need to adhere to. And this is where you get a lot of these traditional values from. For example, having duty, morality, being disciplined, having character, honor, justice, living in a righteous way. All of these line up with a fundamental truth, with a higher purpose and a higher meaning. And all of them at their core have some element of self-sacrifice for a larger purpose in common. And these values was what was needed in order to be able to move the agricultural age forward so it could reach its full potential. And what that meant was that it would reach the full potential of its human and animal labor. It also meant that it reached its potential by giving people some time to think about the deeper questions of life, to question things, which allowed for things like the Renaissance and the Enlightenment to come forward and sprout out of this environment. Now, the Enlightenment and the Renaissance probably couldn't have happened at an earlier time in history because simply the environment and the context wasn't right for it. The Middle Ages brought us many good things and many not so good things. One of the good things that it brought us is that it gave us a working legal framework, a legal framework that worked within hierarchies and that applied up and down the hierarchy. So you wouldn't have someone that sits at the top of the hierarchy like a king. They would be able to come and do as they please. There was a fabric on which it allowed everybody to work things out. And this was the type of structure that was needed in order for nation states to be able to emerge, for laws and for commerce to be able to take and expand and evolve, and for the Industrial Revolution and for ideas to be able to spring forward. And now, this brings us to the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution solved the fundamental problem of human labor. And it did so through using machines. Machines for the first time allowed us to repeat, automate tasks, and to use energy, other forms of energy, in order to get things done. Instead of muscle energy, now we can use a steam engine as an example. And this opened up the world. What it did was it created a huge amount of opportunity for people to go work in urban centers, to move to cities, to work at factories, and that by doing so, you can create a much better life for yourself, a much better quality of life, meant that more and more people were moving away from farms and into cities every single year. And from 1840, where about 8% of the US population lived in farms, it took only until 1920 to get that over 50%. And so in that small 70-year period, we had this huge transformation of society. And the old values, the old traditional values, were not as useful in this new urban environment. What had changed was that the things that we were doing to create value were fundamentally different. Now, what was valuable was that you were logical and rational, that you had a deterministic and scientific way of thinking and seeing the world. And so this is where we come to our modern values. And so the things that we really start to value are progress, prosperity. We become optimistic, self-reliant, strategic. We take risks. We become competitive. We focus on mastery, rationalism, and professional development. These are the values of the Enlightenment, come into full fruition in the industrial age. And like the systems before it, we project this onto our beliefs and our relationship with reality. Now, during the agricultural traditional values, we assumed that since we create everything in the world, that the world must be created. Now, in the Industrial Revolution era and modernism, we believe that since we're using the laws of nature, then nature must be governed solely by law. We started to see reality as simply being a very large machine, a large mechanism. And so the world reality itself has become fundamentally materialistic. And by becoming fundamentally materialistic, what that means at the core is that what matters is matter itself. Ultimately, everything will go dust to dust. None of the stars or planets will survive eternity, that's for sure. Maybe a few billion years at most, but probably not even that. So, with this comes disillusionment, a sense of alienation, a sense of deep meaninglessness, and existential angst. Now, the question of why, and what a greater meaning, if there is such a thing, come to fruition. We could no longer go back in time and believe in a simpler model of the world. We've seen too much. At the same time, modernists come up to these sort of problems where we've started to lose our humanity and we've turned ourselves into machines. And with this comes the next age, the age that we're in now, the digital age. And the big transformation in the digital age is that we've gone from matter to information. Now, what we see isn't that matter matters, but that information matters. That bytes could move bits, and that information itself is the technology. That's what programs do, after all. And through information, we can transform our world. Now, the emergence of IT coincides with postmodernism. And postmodernism is born after this moment following World War II, a moment where some people started to reflect and question the values of modernity. It was through modernism that we were able to create such great war machines, seen in World War I and seen in World War II, and then the atom bomb. And so it was through our modernism that we were able to put the world and ourselves in a situation where the world could literally end at any minute through the Cold War. And that was the environment where a lot of people were in the 1960s. They were in a moment of time where annihilation was possible. And in this moment, they started to ask the deeper questions. They started to wonder if really rationalism was enough. Because rationalism for sure didn't prevent 2 world wars and 100 million deaths. So rationalism couldn't get us out of the very thing it put us into. And science was the method that was used to get to this point in the first place. And so for the first time, we started to see a deconstruction of values, where the idea that there would be a grand narrative that could solve our problem had failed. And as grand narratives have failed, so has the idea of there being one complete and total truth, or one body responsible for such a truth. And with it, the idea of hierarchy itself has come into question. Now, things are seen from the point of view of perspectives. And if there are just multiple different points of view, why is it that any one of them should preside over any other? And this is where, for the first time, perhaps, we started to put ourselves in other people's shoes. We started to ask questions about why certain people were being discriminated, why women could participate in World War II but couldn't afterwards, why racism and sexism was the way it was. And with it, there was a lot of change that was born out of these questions. With postmodernism, we entered the world of the psychological, the relativistic, all in the name of sensitivity, inclusivity, and being more human. Now, on the flip side, what this also meant was that there was no fundamental truth, that there was no real purpose, and that the purpose was something that should be created by each individual person. The chief problems it was trying to address was the human element, living with dogma, divisiveness, materialism. And we see that today. We see that in our cultural wars, as these three very distinct and very different value systems confront each other. We have traditionalism and modernism and postmodernism come to a head. And with each of these systems, as we shall see in a little bit, with each of them, one of the things that happens is that they see the other systems as fundamental threats. Postmodernism, for example, is deconstructive in its very nature. It deconstructs modernism and traditionalism. And so inherently, modernists and traditionalists will see postmodernists as threatening. Now, and this is fundamental, each of these eras has brought in its own set of technologies. It's through their ideologies that the technologies took a particular shape. And we're at that moment today, where we're having postmodernism coincide with artificial intelligence and the digital information revolution. With modernism, life was really about being rational and logical. Today, it's about being psychological. It's about having your own world, your own perspective, your own point of view, living out your own truth and your own purpose. And we see this in our technologies, where when you go online, there's multiple point of views. There isn't any single source of truth. We're in an era of information overload where we cannot tell one narrative apart from another. Anyone could say anything. Our communities are fragmented, where we see multiple different types of communities. Every single type that could exist exists online and attract its own members. People online get to curate their own identity. You can think about all the different identities you have online now. You have one identity for your LinkedIn profile, another one for Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and so on. Each of these represents a different part, a different focus, a different version of you. Art is also easily mixed, reappropriated, and it's fuzzy even on who created it. The ideas of authorship, originality, copyright, all these things are becoming very ambiguous today. We're also entering a world of hyper-reality with VR, AR, and the metaverse, where very soon, each of us will be able to live exactly the type of experience, the type of life that we want to. And that fundamentally, this is where we're headed. We're headed into a world outside of us that mimics and reflects our own inner world that's inside of us. And like all the ages before it, we see the world according to our time period, our moment in time. This is the way we're starting to see the world today. A world that anything is possible, but nothing really means anything. And this inherent meaninglessness is also beginning to be projected on the nature of reality, on our relationship with it, and what we are beginning to believe about it. For example, not so long ago, the world was seen as materialistic. It was seen as a big machine that was moving according to the rules and the laws of physics. That things were fundamentally materialistic, made of matter. Later on, we discovered that matter was really just energy. And today we're starting to see the world from the point of view of computation and information. There are theories and ideas in the pop culture that the world is nothing more than a large computer simulation. That we are in fact living a simulated reality. And now we have come to a head. Our postmodernism is being projected out onto our view of reality itself. The meaninglessness that we feel and experience internally, the meaninglessness of the actual lived experience gets projected on our view of reality itself as being nothing more than a simulation, a computer game of sorts. And this is what I find so fascinating, that each of these eras brought about its own set of solutions to the challenges and the problems that it was facing. It also brings an apex, a climax of the type of technologies that produce a set of experiences that really put us in the middle of what it is like to be that. Today, we get to really experience what it is to be modernist and postmodernist. And to some degree, depending on where you live, even traditionalist. And so let's talk a little bit about how these three different value systems are coming to a head, because this is where we are. You have one group of people that in some sense is reality denying, another group that sees life as nothing more than just a big machine and that you're nothing but a cog in it, and a third where there is inherent meaning, a God that must be followed and obeyed, and so on. The biggest takeaway of everything is that each age's prominence comes to an end precisely when it's reached its peak in terms of producing value. And once it cannot really produce any more value, what happens is that there's a tremendous opportunity to go elsewhere and to create and extract value, to produce value. And this is where we are, because our modernists and our science and our technology has really maximized a lot of the value that it could produce in the world, in the same way that our agricultural age did. And our postmodernism, in its self-reflectivity, in its sensitivity, has also produced a maximum amount of value. I don't know that there's much further that we can go in terms of postmodernism than we have already. The other inherent flaw with postmodernism is that since it is inherently deconstructive, it doesn't actually provide a framework for moving forward. So with traditionalism and modernism, you have a framework for moving forward. Socially, you have some sort of coherence. You have a set of values and ideals that could be worked on through a collective effort. With postmodernism, you don't have that. What you have is a deconstruction of values. You have a sort of looking in the mirror. In some sense, postmodernism is psychoanalyzing itself, but doesn't have any tools of actually manifesting or actualizing the best possible version of itself. And so now it should be clear that what we really need is change. And here comes the problem. And the problem really is power. And the power problem isn't where you think it is. The power problem exists in why. Now, we're often led to believe, we assume that power resides in countries or organizations or powerful people who make decisions that influence the rest of society, society's thoughts and beliefs and so on. But that's not really what power is or how it works. The real power is in why powerful people, powerful organizations, and powerful countries do what they do. That's the answer. The answer is in their set of motivations. And these set of motivations can be found in their ideologies and what they believe to be true about the world and themselves. And as a general rule, what happens is that the most powerful people and institutions of an ideology will do everything in their power to uphold. After all, it's these ideologies that produced them and gave them their power in the first place. And so any challenge to it is going to be seen as a direct and personal threat. And in this way, the real power resides in the ideology itself. It resides in the ideology's ability and power to produce value. And as long as it produces value to people, then people will stand up and defend that ideology and their way of life. Now, ironically, it isn't other systems that are ever the real threat of any ideology. The real threat always ends up being in an ideology's inability to address its own weaknesses, which is expressed in their defensiveness and lack of self-awareness, their unwillingness to change. And this is what makes it difficult or impossible in many cases to address core issues, which ultimately could lead an ideology to decay. And this is where we see ideologies start to fall apart. Ideologies only start to fall apart when they decay from within and when they could no longer produce value for people. Now, with the three main ideologies of today, note that almost a half of the world's population still live in agricultural settings on farms and produce value very literally through farm work. And so traditional values are clearly still viable and valuable in today's world. And so are modern values, and so are postmodern values. And at the same time, while they're providing value, they are also decaying from within. And so we're seeing this dichotomy that even though they're providing value on one end, on the other end, they're starting to fall apart from within. And we see how they're falling apart in their inability to address the ever-changing world that we're in. You can see that it's as if each of them has pre-canned, predetermined solutions, regardless of what the actual context or situation is, or what sort of answer, response, solution is really called for. And we're seeing this in many different areas of life. We're seeing how our institutions are failing. We're seeing how ecologically we're falling apart. And we're also seeing that even businesses are struggling. We're starting to see failure on multiple levels. And the only response by each of our ideological systems of the day has been to double down and fight. To fight for their ideas, even though it was their ideas that helped bring us to this very moment. And so now this begs the question of what's actually next. Like all of the previous ideologies and value systems, these ones too have reached a point where we're seeing diminishing returns, and they're no longer able to, on their own, address the problems of today. In other words, there's another set of values, another way of thinking, another paradigm that's going to emerge that is going to be able to solve the problems of today. So let's talk about what that is. What typically happens next is what's natural and necessary. In the same way that water flows downhill, naturally, disorder will lead to order. Very naturally, over time, societies will flow into the areas where there is the greatest amount of opportunity to produce value. This is becoming clear on what that is. And what the world needs more than anything else is stability and renewal. What we need to do is we need to restore the stability to a disordered world. We need to have and be conduits of order, and we need to do it in a way that is holistic and integrative. Right now, there's three main value systems that are still clearly bringing value into the world. And so what we need to do is acknowledge that. And also, we need to integrate these three values because it's also clear that the world isn't one thing. There's many different places in the world. There's places where traditional values work very well. Like, for example, in most rural settings. In most rural settings in most parts of the world, in fact. And we also know that modernist values work really well in certain contexts and situations. If you're, for example, starting a business, modernist values are going to really help you. If you're running scientific experiments, and if you're doing communities, then postmodern values help. So you need to take the best out of all of these three different value systems and consider ways in which you could implement and use and integrate them. And then to consider that these values are here to serve you, that you're not here to serve them. And also, as these environments that we're in, that you're in, change over time or change quickly, you're going to need different types of solutions in order to be able to address the challenges and the problems that environment requires. So you need to consider what is necessary, natural, and next, so that way you flow with what is required within that context. And then you can focus on what's going to work. You can focus on functionality, competence, being flexible, and what's needed in a given situation. This way, you're not coming into situations with a predefined set of answers. Now, in practical terms in your everyday life, the wisdom traditions can give tremendous value to oneself. Modernism and rationality are great tools for achieving prosperity and accomplishing goals. Even educating oneself in personal development is very modernist. And postmodernism can help us embrace complexity, ambiguity, and help us question the nature of our own reality and our evolving identity. These are some of the ways where we can use these different value systems. And ideally, what we want to do is become masters of these ideologies, not their slaves. So with this, I bid you farewell.